All right, I guess recording started. So welcome to the Cleveland Developer Group. Our topic today is a series of 5 short demos. Not real long, but definitely packed with a variety of topics that hopefully you will find useful. To kick things off with our first one, many of you may have seen, it's been at least a year now since they announced Salesforce, the Lightning Design System 2, also known as the Cosmos theme, that is available to use and provides a more modern design from the current screens from Lightning. As you prepare your orgs to move to this, highly recommend that you make sure you test out your org first. So having a sandbox, switching it to that SLDS 2 theme, possibly developing your own SLDS 2 theme so that it's branded for your org, and testing via observability. You know, what looks the way you expect it to, what maybe doesn't as much, especially when it comes to things like items and flows or Visualforce pages that don't have a code-based checker that you could work with your developer, or a developer on your team could work through and check from. Additionally, there is the linter to check the feasibility of your Lightning components, both the Aura and the LWC ones, to see what recommendations that Salesforce makes, if there's any potential errors with the various tags and the use of CSS for the new design system. That's kind of my demo today, is actually on the use of that linter. So to use that linter, you're going to want to do it most likely from VS Code, is probably the easiest. You're going to obviously want the Salesforce extension pack added in, have your connection to your org. You're going to want to install the Serif Viewer extension, which is from Microsoft Dev Labs, just in case you see a different one, that's the one you want. And you're going to have Node.js installed on the machine as well. And then you go in and you can run it. Usually the first time I recommend running the npx command that says on here to make sure everything is installed for it. And it'll kind of prompt you if it's not and ask you to install, and you can say yes. From then on, you can and it gives you all the errors right when it runs, but it gives it to you right in the terminal at that point. So it's usually easier to run it with report creation. So using the npx command provided here, or actually there is a menu command for generating that Serif report, which then you can refer to as often as you need to, because it'll save it within your project. As you go through, you review that report and you make corrections. I had the opportunity to listen to some of the product team who is working on SLDS2, and they said to just, a number of the things that we get are warnings, and they said make sure you're working on those as well, because there's a really good chance that many of those warnings in the future will actually become errors rather than staying at warnings. And then they've also added a command where you can automatically fix some of those errors that you can use as well, and it'll take care of the fixes, and then you just need to deploy those changes to your org. So let's get to the demo. So I have VS Code here, and I'm actually connected to one of my developer orgs already. And actually, let me figure out how to zoom in. I know there's a zoom on here. Maybe one more. All right. So when you get ready to install this, or to run the linter, obviously you want the extension pack. You're going to want to make sure you have your Aura components from the org as well as your LWCs. If you install the project with manifest, there is a manifest, the package manifest that comes with it, includes those along with your Apex classes, your triggers, but you could just have it so you just have your Aura definition bundles and lightning component bundles. Once you have those, then you can run the command. So I'm actually going to sneak back here and just copy and paste it, or at least attempt to. So right in terminal, you just run that command. If it needs to install, it will prompt you. It takes a little bit. So it starts that process, and actually it's already installed here, and you can see it kind of showed a lot of different things on here that need to be considered, with details and some links. Not necessarily the best format to run it in because it's just sitting here in my terminal, and that makes it a little more difficult. So I tend to prefer to run it from the command menu. So this generate serif report. It asks you what folder you want to perform it on, and obviously I'm running this on the whole project. And you can just say okay, and then it asks you where you want to output the report, and you could actually create a folder within your project if you want to, or you can just let it go at the primary level, which is the default, which is what I'm going to do. And it takes a moment. It actually tells me here it was generated, and then the report shows up on my list, and it's called SLDS-report serif. You can rename this if you want to. And then I can just open it by clicking on it, and I get it in this nice format where they show you everything in the report, but then they give you this viewer to help you see the results a little better. So I can see I've got 5 different files that have various issues. These happen to all be warnings. There were no errors. But for example, my sales summary component, CMP, which is an OR component, it has 2 issues that it points out. And if I click on each of those issues, it'll give me more details as well as showing me exactly where that is in the code and what their recommendation is for changing. And in this case, it's switching it to just var. So if I wanted to correct that, just put that right in. The second one happens to be very similar. So I could make that correction. I can deploy that back to my org. Hopefully this goes quickly. It doesn't take too long to deploy. And now if I were to close this, hopefully if everything went well and I rerun it, I'm going to rename this one. So we'll just call this V1. I'm just going to go ahead and generate again with the same criteria. Open the new report that got generated, and I'll come over here and it's still there. All right, we'll have to figure out what happened there, but all right, because it's there. But maybe it didn't catch it. I don't know. I'll have to look. So that was not successful, but at least I've got the report and I can use it. And I've been using it at my regular job, and we've resolved a fair number of issues already, and there's still a few more to go. So that is that demo. So back to the slides. This next slide, and these slides will be put out and available through both SlideShare as well as the event page. There are some links here for resources that tell you where to find the information that I use to be able to run the Linter program, as well as the Trailhead badge that's out there for helping you get ready for SLDS 2. So that's the first demo. Our next demo is on the new flow approval process. So many of you have, you've seen the warnings, because this month the workflow rules and process builders are being officially deprecated. deprecation in this case means that they will no longer be supported. You can still use them. They're still there. They'll still run. But if you run into issues with them, you cannot get assistance from Salesforce support on them after the end of this month. At some point, then they will be officially retired sometime in the future. It's usually about a year later, in which point then workflow rules and process builders will no longer work. So their recommendation is to move to Flow. With that, the approval process has not yet reached that stage. The old approval process is very workflow based. It uses the alerts and the updates that we used for workflow rules. That there's been no announcement at all about that going away. However, they've started building out this flow approval process and making it available. It is an orchestration, so it's an Omni orchestration that's available. It gives you the option of either a record triggered or an auto launched approval. I really recommend the record triggered. The only method for auto launch is a button on the record. You really can't do it any other way. And within this orchestration, you basically, when you're working on it, you need to build multiple flows. So you need to create a screen flow for the approvers to provide their decision. There is a template provided that you can utilize and extend or modify as you need to within some limitations, because there are things that you really need. And then additionally to that, you can create auto launch flows that will do things like make record updates, create logs, help process records after decisions have been entered. With all of that, then you put it together into this flow approval process, which is an orchestration and runs in stages and can also have decisions. With this, there's a new approvals app. So these approvals no longer show on the home screen in the items to approve. Instead, there's its own app where you can see the approvals, or you do still get the email messaging if you want, provided you've done the setup for it, so that your approvers get an email saying that, hey, there's a record you need to approve. And then the person who submitted it and possibly others get the messages about where it's at in that approval process, if it's been approved, rejected, etc. And you can add that individual approval or what's called the orchestration work item actually into the record page, so that they can review the record when they're working on making their decision. So I will demonstrate that as well. So I'm going to go into my demo org here. So I have this object that I call Way, and Way is a recognition award type object. So it's a custom object in which a user can enter and say, hey, I want to recognize my coworker. This is the reason I want to recognize them, and this is what I want them to receive as recognition. So it's got a thing for like gift cards. The older process, which is now disabled because I've kind of learned through trial and error that having them both enabled at the same time, both a flow one and this old style, does not work properly because of the record locking. But my old process basically said that, hey, when the record was newly created, we're going to kick off and create this process. So, or at least that's and it was actually triggered originally through a process builder. It locks the record. Initially, it sets the status depending, which I did not build into the new approval flow, but I could have. That approval is sent to this queue for the approval, and I'm going to talk about that as well. And then once the decision is made, obviously the decision is recorded as either approved or rejected, and then the status is updated based on what that status was. In the case of approval in this one, it was moved to a distribution-based status. And if it was rejected, it was just said, hey, we're done. The record's now closed. So for the new flow approval process, all these now live in flow. And when you go to build the template, and before I do that, I'm just going to show that up here, if it operates. So on the new flow approvals, there's actually a template, so I can start trying this. So you'll see this is the template, approval workflows, evaluate approval requests, and this is that screen flow I was telling you need so that the person can make the decision. I built one out. I actually used that template. So I'm gonna come back here to it. And I called it just weigh approval process decision. So I'm actually gonna open that so we can take a look at it. And this is mostly the default out of the box template. Oh, wrong one. That is my process decision. I meant this, the evaluate approval requests. Okay. This is a screen flow. So you can see it's just a simple screen flow. It's got a single screen. The screen is fairly simple. It's just got the approval decision as radal buttons and room for the comment, which, you know, it's got help text in it. You may want to actually change that help text. I had not in this one, but it is, you know, right here where, you know, it says optionally enter comments. Or if you need to make it required, you can do that in this screen. You do have some limited ability to change the labels for the decisions. I do not recommend changing the API or the value of the choices, but you could change the label if you wanted to. I ran into some issues when trying to do that with a flow approval process I was creating. Additionally, it provides by default two output variables for you, the approval comments and the approval decision, obviously created from the screen. And then I tend to add another one that I call approval user. And when I set that approval user, I make the default value the running user and their ID, so that I can use that in later steps, like if I want to record who it was who approved, especially if that approval is going to a group of people and not just one. And we're set up so that anyone could approve. So that is the screen flow piece. The second is your processing piece. So the auto-launched flow that you use to update records as a result of the approval. So in this case, you have to set the input variables first. So my input variables in this case are pretty much matching those output variables from the screen. So the approval comments, the approval decision, and the approval user that I created. And then the last one is obviously record ID for the record that we are updating. You know, if I needed to, I could run a get records in this auto launch flow, but really I've kept this pretty basic. So in this particular flow, I'm looking at what was the approval decision. Was it the approve, which is the value, or something else? You can create a recall mechanism for these flows, for these approval processes as well. Obviously there would be no decision in those. So if I was doing this where I also had a recall that maybe reset it to new or something, I would most likely have a third branch here of some kind about what's going on. And then in here I have, if it was marked as approve, I'm recording the comments if there is any. I'm capturing the date time of when this is running. I'm catching who made the decision that it was an approval, and then I'm updating my final status. All on my primary object. So this is all sitting in the primary object rather than in a secondary object. There is still a secondary object recording the approval. I think that is actually great for auditing, but most of the updates are happening here. And then if the was not approved in this case, I'm recording that information about when it was happened. If there were any comments, I'm marking it as rejected and giving it a different status. Great. So, you know, individual flow plus that, or process flow and the screen. And then you get into the actual building of the approval process, which is the flow approval process type. And this is where it's a little different because it's an orchestration. So it is not just your standard flow. When you add items to this, you are actually adding stages or decisions. So the first piece of this is obviously, and I chose a record triggered, auto launch would be different. And again, you would then have to create a button on the object. But for my record triggered flow, I basically am just using when the record is created for this particular object. You could also have conditions. If you normally would have done a button, or you wanted it to call maybe from another flow that's running, I would probably recommend doing that by updating a field and having that update of that field be the trigger for a record trigger approval. It's going to be a little bit easier because otherwise it really is your only other option for auto launched approval process is a button on the object. Within the flow, you're going to create stages that combine the various steps. So say this is a fairly simple approval process, but say you had a 2-level approval process, because maybe it's for a discount on a product that, first, the manager has to approve it, and then maybe a regional manager or additional supervisor or maybe legal has to approve it because it's contract related. And you could have multiple stages with the various pieces you need for the steps there to be able to have multiple of the approval step as well as any background steps. So in this case, when I add the approval step, and I actually have 3 steps here, and I will get to that in a bit, but the approval step setup looks kind of like this. So you've got various properties. You've got your label. When do you want it to start? So in this case, I'm having it start after the first step that's part of the stage is marked as completed. What is the action? So this is where you put in that flow, the screen flow you created. And then what's the approver type? So there are user, group, and queue, as well as resource available. One of the things I ran into was, depending on how ownership of the object is set up and when the object was created and the age of your org, you may or may not be able to use the user, group, or queue. I actually got an error message when I was setting this up when I tried to do it with user, group, or queue. So I had to go to resource. Took a little, that's why I have that other background step. That other background step is literally getting the username of, my username in this org. I'm not sure exactly what the resource value needs to be for a group or queue. I'm guessing it may need to be the developer name, but I don't know for sure. I will have to research that one yet. But in this case, I've got a resource, and it's basically from this first background step I put in, which is also an auto launch flow. I have to get that approver's username to put in, and then it does work. You can customize the email notifications that go out. The recommendation from Salesforce is to stick with the default, at least to start, until you get more comfortable with it. And then also putting in what's the record that this approval is for. Do you want to lock the record? And do you want, even with it locked, can that approver actually make changes to that record even though it may be locked? And then when this action is done, what do you want it to do? You just mark the step completed. I don't know that there were very many other options, and they're difficult for me to see on the screen. So the other piece, the second piece I showed, that auto launch flow, shows up here in a background step. I'm actually starting this after that approval is done. And you need to be really careful about this. The default on these is actually to start when the stage starts, to start this step. So you need to make sure the timing and the order in which these are happening is correct for what your process is. You put in the flow that you want it to run, and if it has input values, you designate those at that point. And then what user do you want to have run this action? So I'm using the automated process user, but you could actually have, a user actually pass through into here, and that's the user that that this auto launch flow actually runs under. Right. So back to this background step. This is the first step in my process, and I have this literally just so I can get who that approver is, because I kind of ran into one of the, what I'll call the gotchas, in that this is an older org, so I couldn't just use the ownership option. Plus, I maybe still had the other approval process on at the time, and that was causing problems. Within the stage itself, there is what says the stage is complete. and you can designate what that is. So a few other things for setup, though, that you need to be aware of. So in Salesforce, there is the process automation settings. Process automation settings for orchestrations, one of the things you have to have is this automated process user email address. If you read the information on here, it says that that needs to be an org-wide email address that is set for user selection and as the default no reply. So, org-wide email, or organization-wide email, when you go to create one, if you choose default no reply, it's actually available for all profiles. And you need it to be both user selection and default no reply to be the automated process user. However, doing this now makes it that no reply address available to any user who can send email. So in at least one of the orgs I've worked on, we've actually done the setup, and then removed the user selection piece afterwards so that people can't actually select it, especially if they're working cases and we need them to only select the email address related to email the case. So just something to keep in mind there for setup. And then the other thing I wanted to show was that new approval app. So like I mentioned, these approvals do not show up on the homepage in the items to approve because they're not using the same objects. Instead, you get this new app, and system admins have access to this tab and the various objects by default. Other profiles or users would need it. You would need to grant them that in either the profile or even better, a permission set, so they can access those actual objects. And you'll see there's 4 tabs. There's also access to the settings as well as the ability to create that flow approval process right from this app. And you can, manage the submissions that are in there. So I have one that's in progress out here, and I can see it, from here. If I needed to, I could recall it, I could cancel it, whatever needs to happen. Or if I'm an approver, I can actually go to it. So I'm actually going to go to this record so you can see what it looks like. This is that orchestration work guide that I was talking about. So I'm actually going to go in here to edit page so you can see what that looks like. So within the page, I'm going to, where I have approvals, I can paste this component in. It is the orchestration work guide that is right here. And I just paste it in. In this case, I don't want it there all the time. Once something's approved or rejected, I don't need it. So I added component visibility to say, hey, when it's one of these 2 statuses, don't display this. The other thing you might do is you might only want it visible for people who are approvers. I would recommend using a custom permission in that case, and then assigning that within a permission set to the users who can do approvals, so that they are the ones who see this component and no one else does on the page. So if I go back to the page, I can, this particular one is the honoree's user group member, and it's a Starbucks gift card for $25 is what the person asked for, who submitted it. And they said, hey, why? Because they asked great questions. So, as the approver, I could choose to approve or reject it. And I can add some comments like, those were really great questions. Finish it. And then the rest of the emails, the email to the original requester goes out, and this record will then update. And if I refresh the page, that component is now gone, but the final decision is approved, the decision maker was recorded, the decision date, time, and the comments all transferred onto my record because of the flow process I had in place. So that is the demo on approval flows. I do have a number of resources in the slides. Again, both the help articles, Salesforce Ben had a article about it that gave some very basics. There are a few different YouTube videos out there you can watch to help you with building them. And then Andy Utkin offers a course. Actually, yes, it's paid. I believe it's not very expensive. Last I saw, it was being offered at like $19 on approval process flows through Flow Canvas. And this is the gotcha I was telling you about, where for some reason when I was building this one, it would not let me use user, group, or queue. It suggests that might be because of the age of the object and the org. So you kind of have to watch for those warnings and error messages you may get as you're building. Hopefully some of those will decrease as Salesforce keeps developing this out. So that's our second demo. And just a reminder, you can post questions in chat anytime, or feel free to unmute and ask if there's anything you have. And our third demo is related to data tables in Lightning Web Components. So the data table Lightning Web Component has a piece where you set up all the columns, and you declare them based on the variables from. So the use case I'm talking about in this is I want a related list on my object, but I want values from some of the lookup objects from that object, and maybe there's some calculated formulas that I want to display within this related list I'm going to create, but I really don't want to create additional formula fields on my object. Either I've already got a lot of fields, or I only need it for this one display. I don't need it in reporting or anything else. So can I do this without having to add to my object? So this LWC, obviously it has an Apex controller, it's OR enabled, and it's really only a simple SQL query from that object, maybe some of the parent fields, using dot notation. And then I'm going to use this. So the JavaScript in my component is taking care of relabeling that dot notation in the parent field, so I can use it in columns very easily, as well as the ability for it to perform that calculation to present that data in my table. So with that, I'm going to go back to VS Code and close the stuff from our other demo. And what I've got is this, and I'm going to start actually with the class. So my class is fairly simple, my controller class. It is a simple query from this custom object that I created called sales summary. Sales summary is basically a listing for each account with a given end date. Basically just the total products and the total spend made by that particular company in my business. And in here in my query, I'm getting that account. I'm also getting the account's name and the account's phone number. And then part of what I want to include in my LWC is kind of an average spend per product. Not a great example, but hey, an example with a calculation in it. Along with being able to provide a link to the summary data record directly, which is one of the major use cases that I saw for this type of need within an LWC data table. So in my component, it's a very basic data table. I've got my data, which I'm calling sales list. I've got my columns, which are columns. Obviously, the key field is ID, and this is just a display, so I don't have the checkbox box enabled because we're not editing records, and if there's an error, it displays an error. And this is a record. It's exposed on record pages. So in my JavaScript, I have my import of my controller class. I've created my columns. So I have my account, and I really want just it's the account name. So I've got a field here that I have ACC name. Obviously, that was not part of the query, so we're going to have to create that. I have my month end date, which I'm calling period end. I have my total products, my total spend. I have that spend per product that I said I want to calculate. And then I have a summary detail, which is my URL link back to the record using a field that I'm calling summary link. Again, not something I queried, but also then having it labeled with the name of the record, which was in my query. So my LWC has the usual API for the record ID. I'm setting my columns and have my variables, and then I have my @wire. Within my @wire, I'm passing the record ID as the parameter, which I need for the Apex class. And then for my wired record, if there's data, I'm then parsing that data. So using JSON parse and stringifying the data, I've got two methods on here. And the reason I have two methods is kind of to demonstrate both. But if all I was really needing to do was relabel the columns so that they don't have that kind of dot notation within them, I could just use the map functionality within JavaScript and say, hey, basically map out each row of data, return the row, plus for this particular field, label it this way. So I'm going to return the row. I'm going to create a column called ACC name, and I'm going to return that dot notationed part of my query result for the account name. So it's now a simple variable name. For the calculation piece, though, I'm using a for each function where I go through those parsed datas, and I'm basically adding in the record the additional variables I want. I could have easily put this in here and said, hey, my new ACC name equals from the res account r underscore name. I could have done that as well in this for each, but I wanted to show both because if I'm not really doing calculations, I can probably just use map, and then it's a much shorter bit of code. And in this case, my spend per product is just the calculated division of that, and then the summary link is literally just my backslash plus the record ID, and then I basically pass the stringified data with my adds back into the variable that I need to display. Within my org, I can see this on a record. Let me get in the right app. So in my little app that this comes from, I can go to the account record, and the only one I actually have data for is this one, but I can see that data shows up, so I can see the account name, the period, the number of products, the total spend, the spend per product, which if I took my calculator, it's calculating right, and then this is actually providing a link to the record, so I could easily click on it and get that record to open and see the original record. Obviously, it does not have the summary, that spend per product field in it, because that's just a calculation I have in the LWC. So again, resources. So the component library for the data table documentation, and then a few other resources related specifically to this. So, how do you get a parent in a data table column from Stack Exchange, as well as an article from Infallible Techie that I found useful when I was working on this. And then this Tech Dicer column, which was about getting that hyperlink column, which led me to be able to do the calculations and add calculated fields, so that I'm taking advantage of the processing power of the client rather than having all of that server side and stored in fields. So that is our third demo. So the fourth demo, I kind of done this one before, but in the past when I've done it, it's been, I think I used Postman last time. So the idea of finding technical data in your org using tooling queries. So things like checking code coverage, checking API versions, And there are plenty of other things that you can use metadata objects and query from the tooling API. The resource I have here is a document I prepared that has a number of those queries that I use. And basically my demo right here is mostly showing that there are plenty of tools that we can use to run these queries. For example, in my org, if I have Salesforce Inspector Reloaded, you have the data export option here. You can write the query that you want. So maybe I want to select, I think it's, let's see. So for my Apex classes, let me find the query really fast. Let's do it that way. So here I can show you what that resource looks like. So the resource is here for API versions. So maybe I want to see what all my classes are for API versions. This is query. I can actually put that into Salesforce Inspector Reloaded right here. Now this particular query does not require tooling API, but some of the others do. So say if I wanted or component bundles or flows, I would probably need the tooling API. But just so you're aware, there's this checkbox right here for tooling API in Salesforce Inspector Reloaded that says, hey, use the tooling API. I can run the query and it gives me the results. I can copy it and then paste it in Excel or as a CSV, or just download it right here with this button and it'll download the result as a CSV for me. Makes it nice and easy, but you can also tell I need to update my API versions and stuff because those are quite a bit old. So that is one easy way to use it, especially with Workbench not, I don't think it's on the latest API version at all. And last I looked, I think 62 was the max, and we're now up to 65, and we'll the next release will be API 66. The other methodology besides the also Postman is to use it the CLI. The nice thing about having a project and doing this with the CLI for me is that I can create scripts for these. So in my scripts, my SQL, I've actually created where I've just stored that query right here. And I have that for the Apex class one, what I do for code, the query for code coverage, as well as a query to get flow versions. The only caution I'll give is before you run the code coverage one, obviously you need to have recently run the tests in your org to get worthwhile results. And then I created just a file to store the commands for me so I remember what they are and so I can copy and paste them. But basically the CLI command is the SF data query command. In this case, I'm using a file rather than writing the query directly. And then I'm creating an output file. I'm putting it into CSV, and I'm also noting that I'm using the tooling API. So if I wanted to run that exact Apex class one, I can just take this command I wrote, throw it in the terminal, and it will, well, it's warning me I'm not up to date with my CLI, but it ran my query, it created my file, it's right here, and I can see those results, and then I can bring it, into Excel if I wanted to, or whatever tool I feel most best for using for my analysis that I want to do on it. And as I mentioned, I can do that, on any of these. So I also have the one I created for code coverage as well, which may or may not have recent results. Probably does not, but we'll try it. And then I get number of lines covered and number of lines uncovered, and I can use that to calculate my code coverage per class or overall and see where do I want to spend time, or where maybe do I have no code coverage, like I did create a test for that. Okay, fabulous. I do have one in here somewhere. Yes, this test object CSV controller that I created that has no code coverage currently because 0 lines are covered. But just a simpler way to do those, especially if I run them often enough. I tend to run these at least quarterly to check where we're at with some of our tech debt in our org where I'm currently working. Also, you could potentially use the Agentforce vibes thing to help you with this. I've struggled to do it well, and I often have to remind it to use CLI commands and not try to write PowerShell commands. Just heads up warning there. And then the last demo, I was going to do an Agentforce vibes demo, just so you can see how some of that is used if you haven't tried it. Just remember when you're using any type of AI, remember human in the loop. There are definitely things that are great about this, and then there are things that aren't quite perfect. So always remember that piece. So in VS Code, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to open that class first that had 0 code coverage in my org, which is right here. So this is my controller, and we already saw from what I ran that it has no code coverage, and I'm going to work with Agentforce vibes to get some help on that. So when I first open Agentforce vibes, you usually have to enable it. And I'm actually going to widen this, and then the other pieces you probably have to click the edit so that it can actually create files, and then I can type my task. So I'm going to just, can you assist me in creating a test class for this file? So test object import CSV controller. Way too basic, and I'd probably do more if I wanted to spend some real time on this. But it just starts, and it tells me it can create a robust Apex test, and the file appears to be present here, and it's going to lay out its plan of what it's doing and tell me what that is. And then throughout this, it's going to ask me to give it access to various things. Say, you know, I've actually already granted it quite a bit of it, so you can actually see it typing away, which is kind of fun. Kind of amazing and a lot of time saving. But it also points out it's going to create a positive path, negative edge cases, a bulk scenario, some FLS enforcement. So it's kind of got a whole series. It's going to make sure it doesn't have some things that we don't want it to have. And it has created those classes. It followed some of the best practices that are out there. We could always give it instructions for additional ones if we had ones if we had PMD rules, it could use that as well. So it created the metadata file. I'm noticing it's version 60 instead of 65, which is the recent, I don't know why it did that time, but it generated this test class. And it was great because it put in some of the PMD requirements of having, hey, that description header for me, and it let me know kind of what it created. And then in here, I will say you do want to review. So it created a private stack to basically build the blob for the import. This particular controller is a Agentforce page controller for importing data from a CSV file. So it's building a file right off where it just adds lines. I think it's not actually showing the data in here, but it's got it. And then it has a number of tests. So it's showing, hey, what if I, can I test basically importing this single row of data that it provided? It does an amazing job providing data. It then, does the asserts, writes the asserts, note that it's using the older assert statements rather than the older system assert, rather than the newer assert class statements. So that might be something you definitely want to watch for and fix. I kind of feel like it's using the older statements because, it's been trained on pre-existing code, and that would have been more prevalent since that assert class is newer for Salesforce. It has one where it added multiple rows. it has one where there is nothing inserted just to make sure it does something and checks. Some of this might be overkill. Maybe I don't want to have as many tests as it produced, but I could then run this, confirm that it provides code coverage, see where there are issues, and what other changes I want to do to it. So that's your quick demo on Agentforce 5s. And with that, that is the end of the demos I put together. Any questions, comments? Anyone have anything they want to demo? I'm more than happy to open the floor. And before we go too far, I will also just throw out thank you for our upcoming events. So our next in-person event is December 17th at Astro Brothers Coffee and Ice Cream in Parmatown Mall, the shops of Parmatown Mall, the outer part. I hope you'll be able to join us if you're local. And then Cleveland Salesforce Saturday, if you're interested in those. We're actually on break for December, but it will be back in January, going to various coffee shops. And then if you're starting to plan for 2026, I have a list of events, mostly the major events from Salesforce, but also keep in mind local Cleveland Give Camp will often need Salesforce developers to help. And they are holding their event the weekend of July 17th to the 19th. And then Buckeye Dreaming is at the end of July. So those are kind of closer to us. So thank you for joining, and I will open it for questions. But first, I'm going to turn off recording.